What's up, nerds? The Middle East is on the brink of a larger regional war, and it's getting worse and worse by the week. We've got Russian ships entering into the Red Sea and Russians building observation posts in the Golan Heights. We've also got Hezbollah launching some of the largest drills that they've launched since the start of the war on October 7th. We've also got the Israeli decision to enter into the city of Rafah. It appears that they're going to do so. So we're going to talk about those things that we've already just mentioned, as well as how Rafah could become the flashpoint for a much larger regional conflict. I'm recording this video on March 29th, 2024. Let's go and talk about all of this. First, let's discuss these Russian ships, because I was totally not tracking this until I saw this. I was scrolling through my phone while I was PRing my squat. No big deal, not a brag. But anyway, this thread by Ariel Osiran basically discusses how the Russians are beefing up their naval presence in the Red Sea, as well as other Russian military actions in the Middle East in recent months. This naval delegation to the Red Sea includes a missile cruiser and a frigate, both from the Russian Pacific Fleet, and he notes that the Kremlin has previously denied that the Houthis have given Russia or China any assurances that their ships will not be attacked. Previously, it had been reported that those countries had received those kinds of assurances. It appears that that might not actually be true, and the presence of the Russian Navy might be an indication that, in fact, they do not have those kinds of protections, and so they're just needing some kind of security for their civilian shipping. He also notes that Russia has not condemned US and UK strikes on the Houthis in recent weeks. This might be another indication that they have not received those kinds of assurances, and they are beginning to see the Houthis as a threat to their own shipping. Ariel also notes the creation of 11 observation posts on the border between Syria and Israel along the Golan Heights by Russian troops. Ariel mentions that this might be because Russia wants greater influence in the region should a larger conflict break out. We know that Russia and Syria have a pretty close relationship. Russia was there to help the Assad regime during the Syrian civil war, and they continue to have a pretty large presence in Syria, not only to help counter ISIS, but also to really help the Assad regime maintain some degree of stability. Now, increased Russian troop presence in Syria to counter ISIS would make a lot of sense given the Crocus City Hall attack. But that being said, these troops are on the opposite side of Syria from where they really need to be. Then they are observing the wrong country. Where they really need to be is on the northeast part of Syria and really along the border of Iraq, where ISIS is known to operate. But even then, we're talking about ISK in terms of the Crocus City Hall attack, which is believed to be more further in Central Asia, like around Afghanistan and Kazakhstan and kind of that area. Now, with all of this, I have a general question left over. What forces does Russia have to credibly pressure Israel? And it's the same question in the Red Sea. What forces do they have to credibly pressure anybody? I mean, 2 naval ships aren't really going to do you much good. Really, that I can tell, this appears to really just be kind of like a token force. It's not really designed to do anything significant. It's notable because, I mean, we're talking Russia here, but at the same time, it's nothing really to get too excited about here. Regardless, in the Golan Heights, they're there, and that's something that Israel has to consider should it consider any operations against Hezbollah, which likely could impact the Golan Heights area. The U.S. also has to consider Russian ships in the Red Sea. Now, they've also had to consider Chinese ships in the Red Sea in the past, so it's not, I mean, it's just more ships to consider. But at the same time, you know, if we're talking tensions in other areas and how that could spill over to other regions of the world, this becomes one of those regions. So far, though, the presence of Russians haven't been a huge issue for the United States, except for that one time that apparently there were no Russians, but that's beside the point. Now, it's not just Russia's movements in the Middle East that tip us off that something larger might be going on. Hezbollah has launched large military drills all throughout Lebanon. These are pretty significant and definitely worth diving into. They simulate fighting in rural and urban areas, including fighting in areas in and around Beirut, as well as areas around the southern border with Israel. They also include rocket attacks on Israeli settlements, and some of those were actually actual real-life rocket attacks on Israeli settlements. I mean, that the drill carries on, but the war does too. And they also included mock evacuations of VIPs from Beirut. This also comes as reports have been continuing to swirl of the Israeli desire to go to war with Hezbollah. There have been reports that Israel has picked up its airstrikes in Lebanon, including a spike in airstrikes against paramedics that are affiliated with Hezbollah, the Amal movement, and the Islamic group. And yes, that's the name of the group, the Islamic group. It's kind of like the Washington football team I kind of like that branding. I'm not going to lie to you. I think that's kind of like, it's minimalist. So good job, the Islamic group. Now, there is concern that with these airstrikes on paramedics, that Israel is attempting to provoke Hezbollah into launching a larger attack in retaliation, and Israel can use that as an excuse to go to war with Hezbollah. Right now, Israeli troops in Gaza appear to be at one of the lower levels that they've been since the start of the war. And those troops that have been rotated out could be moved north and used to fight against Hezbollah. And Israel is going to need all of the troops they can really get at this point. We consider again that Hamas is not considered a peer with Israel. Israel has had military superiority over Hamas pretty much his entire time. The only thing that makes Hamas very difficult is its ability to blend into the civilian population, blend into civilian infrastructure and its tunnel network. But in a stand-up fight, it's not really that fair. Now, that being said, in the north with Hezbollah, Hezbollah is much larger, they're much more capable, they're much better equipped and trained, and they're way more supported by their allies, not only across the Middle East with other groups and what's called the axis of resistance, but also with Iran. Israel has enough troops to get into Rafah, but they're going to need more troops to fight in the north in order to win that war. Now, I have seen that they have sent home some of the reservists that they called up at the start of the war. I'm not sure if a war kicks up with Hezbollah, if they're going to recall some of those reservists to fight again, or what that would look like. I think it would really depend on how far this conflict goes, because whenever we're talking about a regional war, before we were just talking about a war in Gaza. Now we're talking about a war potentially not just in Gaza. It could potentially include Egypt. We'll get into that in a second. Could potentially include the whole of Lebanon with where Hezbollah operates, as well as potentially parts of Syria and Iraq where other axis of resistance groups exist and would want to fight Israel. It also needs to be stated that a war between Israel and Hezbollah would be incredibly nasty. Far worse than the war in Gaza. I know that that's hard to believe because of just how bad the war in Gaza has been, but this could be much, much, much worse, not only because of the size and scope of the battle space just expanding. Consider with the war in Gaza, the war's really been limited just to Gaza. Israel has contained that war in just the Gaza Strip, and what's happening in the Gaza Strip is absolutely horrific. But imagine that, but scaled up to the size of Lebanon, where it's not just the Gaza Strip, it's still going on there, but the country of Lebanon becomes a war zone. And again, we're not just talking about kind of the wars that we as Americans are typically more comfortable, I guess, mentally with or more familiar with, in that they're limited conflicts. There are restrictions on targets that can and cannot be hit. There are protections for civilians. Israel has not really shown some of that. I mean, what we've seen so far is Israel's fighting in what it believes to be a war of survival right now. So there are no restrictions. It's hitting just about anything. It's still, reportedly, at least, having some considerations for warning civilians. And we're going to talk about how Rafah is going to be a huge example on where they're at today on that. But they're also fighting a war, and they're fighting to win. They're not fighting to win hearts and minds. They're fighting to win the war and destroy the group that they're fighting. So if Israel has to upend all of Lebanon to destroy Hezbollah, then Israel's probably going to do that. And there are millions upon millions of people that live in Lebanon who have not been having a good time. The political and economic situation in Lebanon has not been great over the past 10, 20 years. But that could be much, much, much worse in a war. And we're not just talking about the battle space also just being in Lebanon. Again, we're talking about parts of Syria, parts of Iraq. The axis of resistance spans all the way to Iran pretty much, and down south all the way to Yemen. The Houthis are part of this axis, and they've basically been fighting since this whole thing kicked off. So we're not only talking about a battle space ranging from Gaza to Lebanon. This space could basically expand pretty quickly throughout the entirety of the Middle East. Now, I'm not quite sure that we would see all the different axis of resistance groups immediately get engaged once a war between Hezbollah and Israel kicks off. We might see a scale up in involvement between some of these groups. Like we have so far. We've seen whenever the war kicked off, we saw some groups targeting U.S. troops. That kind of went away, and we're going to talk about that here in just a moment. But we might see those groups kind of kick off involvement again against U.S. troops in the area, against Israel, and against other groups that they believe to be affiliated with Israel. Now, if it gets to the point where Hezbollah's existence is threatened, where Israel might be winning the war and they're getting to a point where they've killed enough of the leadership, they've killed enough of the fighters that the core group of Hezbollah might be threatened, then that's where we might see Iran actually get involved themselves. Now, if that isn't all bad enough, lucky for us, we still have the town of Rafah, which appears that Israel has likely already made the decision to go into the city of Rafah, and that's where we're seeing kind of more political clashes between the United States and Israel over how to handle this. The United States has been at odds with Israel over this because of concerns over the humanitarian catastrophe that would likely unfold. President Biden said that this would be a red line. I'm not going to lie to you. We've seen U.S. administration set red lines in the Middle East before, and those red lines were crossed and nothing happened. So we'll see if that means anything here. But there's believed to be somewhere around 1.4 million Palestinians crammed into this tiny area in and around Rafah. And it is, I've mentioned before, it's believed to be the final stronghold for Hamas, since that's where the IDF has not yet gone. And from Israel's perspective, for them to fully dismantle Hamas as an organization, they're going to have to go into Rafah and take care of that. But they're also going to have to come up with an answer for each and every one of those civilians to not exacerbate what has already been a catastrophic humanitarian catastrophe. Now, while the U.S. has criticized Israeli plans to go into Rafah, that I have seen, they have not, at least publicly, laid out counter plans on how to go about this in a more constructive way. Egypt has in the past threatened Israel over the town of Rafah should Israel go in. In fact, they've threatened to void the peace deal. They've released some old intelligence showing their intelligence that they had on Israel during the 7 Days War. And really the vibes coming out of Egypt don't really look that good. Again, this could become very, 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 very nasty very, very fast. And like what we've talked about already with the conflict in Lebanon, this conflict could easily make what's happened in the rest of Gaza look like child's play. And we've already talked about the capabilities of Hezbollah and some of their affiliated groups. Well, if Israel's having to take care of them and potentially the Egyptian military, or at least, threats from the Egyptian military and countering them with a military buildup of their own just to deter any kind of action from Egypt, well, then they're going to have their hands full very fast. Now, we've talked a lot about Israel's situation here, but I'm an American, you can probably tell, and the majority of my audience is Americans as well. But it still matters and impacts us as Americans. There are still U.S. troops in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere in the Middle East. They could easily find themselves, and very quickly find themselves, being targeted directly by some of or most of these groups. U.S. ships have long been dueling with the Houthis in the Red Sea. We've seen U.S. troops being targeted in missile and rocket attacks by groups in Iraq and Syria. We've seen one U.S. airstrike that killed one of the leaders of one of the groups in Iraq, and that ended those strikes in a hurry. And I think that kind of shows that the U.S. still, to some degree, maintains some level of credible deterrence. And that's not just a buzzword. I mean, the real word is credible deterrence, meaning you actually have to kill the decision maker who is threatening U.S. soldiers' lives. And it worked in this case. They killed the leader, and we have not seen further strikes on U.S. soldiers. And it's been that I've been tracking at least maybe a month and a half or so since that happened. Now, should a war break out between Israel and Hezbollah, that might not be enough at all. In fact, those groups might likely just commit to the fight, and no amount of deterrence will be able to keep them from striking at U.S. forces. That takes us right back to square one of U.S. troops being in harm's way because of a war that they're not directly involved in, and with no end in sight to this conflict. So that's all joyful and good. And aren't we so happy? Now, on the bright side, it is Easter weekend. I do hope that all of you have a great, Easter weekend with your friends and family. Jesus is risen, and hopefully he comes back before this mess gets way worse. Then I won't have to be here to watch it get much, much, much worse. Now, sound off in the comments with where you think things with Rafah or Hezbollah are going to go. Sound off with, what impact, if any, Russia might have in all of this. I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Let's continue this conversation. Like this video if you found it informative, and subscribe for more analysis, not only on this war in Israel, but also on the war in Ukraine and other conflicts as they pop up. With all that, I'll see you all later. Bye.